She didn't expect to cry that day. It was just another late shift, the kind of night where the clink of plates and distant laughter blend into white noise. Her apron smelled faintly of grease. Her feet ached. And like always, she wore that tired smile, the one that said, "I'm fine," even when she wasn't. When he walked in, she didn't recognize him at first. She was too busy wiping down tables, making small talk, managing that invisible line between service and invisibility. She didn't notice the look in his eyes, didn't catch the bodyguards or the familiar tattoos. Just another customer, just another table. But he noticed her. That's how it begins, not with fireworks or music swelling in the background, but with someone truly seeing you when you've almost forgotten you're worth seeing. That simple human gaze, present, clear, free of judgment. It has the power to crack something open inside you. Carl Jung spoke often of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we disown, suppress, or hide out of shame. For many, especially those in service roles, that shadow isn't just personal, it's social. We live in a world where kindness gets overlooked, where exhaustion is expected, and where people working double shifts rarely get a second glance. Her shadow wasn't made of mistakes or regrets. It was made of unseen effort, of being good without reward, of holding others up while no one held her. So when the check came and she returned to clear the table, everything still felt normal. But then she saw the bill note. It wasn't just the number, though yes, the tip was massive, almost surreal. It was the words, something handwritten, simple, honest. "I see how hard you're working. You're more than this shift, you're seen." That's when it broke. Not because she was weak, but because for once someone acknowledged her full self. Not just the smile or the service or the pleasantries. They saw her. And when someone reaches through your defenses like that, when they speak to the parts you thought the world had forgotten, it's overwhelming. She stood there, shoulders shaking, hand over her mouth, tears slipping out without permission. The room didn't change, but she did. As we grow older, recognition changes its shape. In our 20s, we often crave attention, applause, success, even validation from strangers. But by the time you reach your mid-40s or beyond, what you long for isn't the spotlight. It's acknowledgement, quiet, sincere, human acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't flatter your ego, but honors your soul. That waitress wasn't crying over money. At her age, she's likely seen highs and lows. She's probably balanced rent with groceries, skipped vacations, and learned to stretch every dollar. No, what moved her was something far rarer, someone pausing to reflect her worth back to her without agenda. That kind of recognition is profoundly healing, especially when you've carried on for years without it. Carl Jung taught that many emotional wounds linger, not because they were dramatic, but because they were dismissed. The parts of ourselves that suffered in silence, the long hours, the emotional labor, the days we pushed through while others overlooked us, those are the shadowed layers of our psyche. They don't cry out loudly. They just quietly pile up, forming a subtle ache that never fully goes away. And then, someone sees it, names it, honors it. In a culture that often equates value with youth, beauty, or status, being recognized in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, when you feel invisible, can feel like oxygen after years underwater. It's not about being rescued. It's about being remembered by life, by grace, by the shared humanity we all carry. In Jungian terms, this is the moment the ego meets the soul. When your outer identity, the role you play in the world, gets pierced by something deeper, more essential. The waitress wasn't just seen as a server. She was seen as a human being with dignity, fatigue, kindness, and quiet endurance. That's why the tears came, not from pain, but from release. For many in midlife, we're not looking for applause. We're looking for those rare, sacred moments when someone sees through the mask and touches the truth. Because here's the truth. Recognition isn't about being celebrated. It's about being witnessed. That man, whether he knew it or not, offered her that gift. A reminder that she hadn't disappeared, that her effort mattered. That someone saw her and cared enough to say so. And for anyone over 45, That kind of moment can stay with you for life. You can't always see it, but most people are carrying something heavy, especially by midlife, losses that never fully healed, choices made in survival mode, emotional debts unpaid, and the quiet, exhausting work of showing up every day for others while silently wondering, when will someone show up for me? For many women working service jobs in the US, this invisible weight becomes part of their posture. They smile, even when their heart is tired. They remember birthdays for customers who never ask about theirs. They anticipate needs, apologize for things outside their control, and often go home wondering if they're making any difference at all. Jung would call this the persona, the mask we wear to survive social expectations. It's not fake, it's functional. But over time, if it becomes the only face we show, we forget what we look like underneath. And what happens to that hidden self? The part of you that once dreamed, raged, danced, or even just rested? It gets buried beneath responsibilities. Now think about the kind of exhaustion that builds over decades. It's not just physical, it's emotional erosion. 1,000 small self-abandonments. You don't even notice the weight anymore, until something makes you set it down. That moment with McGregor wasn't about a celebrity stepping into her life. It was about life interrupting her routine with unexpected compassion. It was an emotional mirror held up by a stranger that said, "You matter. I see you." And that cracked something open. The older we get, the more these cracks matter. They're not signs of weakness, they're entry points for truth. Jung believed that the second half of life is when the soul begins to call more loudly, not for success, but for integration, bringing the lost, silenced parts of ourselves back into the light. For that woman, maybe she hadn't cried in years. Maybe she had grown so used to holding everything in that she forgot what letting go even felt like. But in that moment, she wasn't just reacting to the gesture. She was reconnecting with herself, her tiredness, her strength, her worth. When we allow ourselves to be witnessed in our vulnerability, something ancient heals, something that began to fracture long before we had words for it. She didn't just break down, she broke open. And sometimes that's exactly what the soul has been waiting for. Isn't it strange how deeply kindness can shock us? By the time most people reach their 40s or 50s, they've grown used to disappointment. Not because they're negative, but because life, quite simply, teaches endurance. Promises are broken. People forget. We adjust expectations downward, quietly learning that it's safer not to hope too much. So when someone offers a pure gesture, uncalculated, free of agenda, it doesn't just warm the heart, it disorients it. That's why the waitress cried. Because she didn't see it coming. She wasn't expecting to be noticed, let alone affirmed. And when kindness arrives where cynicism has settled in, it's not just beautiful, it's disruptive. Carl Jung understood this phenomenon well. He believed that the parts of the psyche most prone to suffering are the ones least exposed to conscious compassion. Over time, people build emotional armor not to shut others out, but to survive indifference, to protect the core self from the sting of being overlooked. But the cost of that armor, we forget what softness feels like. And when it reappears, like it did in that note on the check, it can feel almost foreign. That moment wasn't just about money or fame. It was about a deeper question. When was the last time someone was kind to me without expecting something in return? Many people over 45 will relate to that. You spend so many years giving, to children, to spouses, to aging parents, to jobs that drain more than they fill, that you begin to wonder if unconditional kindness is even real anymore. So when it shows up, not as a grand gesture, but a handwritten sentence that slices through numbness, it shakes the soul awake. And that's the power of small things done with real intention. They can undo years of quiet disconnection. They can pierce through the learned distrust. They can touch the part of you that remembers what it means to feel safe in someone else's presence, even for a moment. In Jungian language, this is a moment of individuation, where a buried truth is brought back into awareness, reintegrated into the whole self. In emotional terms, it's a moment that says, you are not alone, you never were. The world is still capable of grace. and that is why it made her cry. There comes a point in life when the roles we've played begin to wear thin. Mother, provider, helper, worker. These roles are necessary, even noble, but if we're not careful, they can become prisons, masks we forget we're wearing. Scripts we perform so convincingly that even we start to believe they're all we are. But deep inside, something quieter persists. A voice, a question, a memory of self before the titles. For that waitress, the tearful moment wasn't just about feeling appreciated. It was about the sudden collapse of the role and the reappearance of the person, and that's no small thing. Because when the soul finally speaks, it often does so through emotion. Tears don't always come from sadness. Sometimes they come from recognition. Carl Jung described this return to authenticity as essential to the second half of life. He believed that after decades of outward striving, the psyche begins to turn inward, asking not, "What can I accomplish?" but "Who am I really?" And sometimes, it takes a stranger's eyes to reflect that question back at us. It's no coincidence that this breakdown happened in a moment of stillness, a pause between tasks, a note left behind. Because these are the rare spaces where the soul slips through the cracks, when we're not distracted, not performing, just being. And in that space, our true self often rushes forward, hungry to be seen. This kind of emotional opening can feel overwhelming, especially for those over 45 who've spent years keeping it together, holding families, jobs, and emotional systems in place. Not because they wanted to hide, but because life required it. But we are not machines. And eventually, the soul demands to be felt again. That moment at the table wasn't just about gratitude, it was about permission. Permission to feel, to exhale, to remember that under the responsibilities there is still a woman with longings, exhaustion, beauty, depth. And an entire history no one sees when she brings a menu to a table. And when someone sees that, even briefly, it can undo years of emotional isolation. Because no matter how old we get or how competent we become, we never outgrow the need to be seen, not just for what we do, but for who we are. And when that happens, the mask slips, and the soul, finally, breathes. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't rage or demand. It simply waits, quietly, persistently, in the background of your daily life. It's the pain of being overlooked. And by the time most people reach midlife, they've felt it in some form. Not being chosen, not being asked, being passed over for promotions, for praise, even for simple acknowledgement. You show up, you contribute, and the world keeps moving, as if you were never there. This is not self-pity. It's a psychological reality. Carl Jung referred to this disconnection as a fragmentation of the self. When we're no longer mirrored by the outside world, parts of us start to go numb. The emotional cost isn't immediate, it accumulates, like dust in a room you stop noticing. That waitress? She wasn't falling apart over a single moment. She was releasing the years behind it, years of effort that no one clapped for, years of showing up when she had nothing left, years of smiling through fatigue because that's what was expected. When someone finally saw her, it didn't just touch the moment, it touched all the moments that came before. In the US especially, there's a cultural myth around self-reliance. We're told not to expect anything, to power through, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. But psychologically, that's not sustainable. Human beings need to be seen. We need connection. We need someone to say, "I noticed," even if it's just once. The older we get, the more we carry. The griefs we don't talk about. The relationships that changed. The dreams we quietly let go of to take care of others. And in the midst of all that, invisibility can begin to feel normal, even deserved. That's why this small act meant so much. Because it said, "You are not invisible, not today, not to me." And that message doesn't just soothe, it restores. It's a rebalancing of the emotional scales. A sacred interruption in the narrative of unworthiness. For many over 45, this moment reminds us that kindness still exists, that recognition is still possible, that even if the world has been loud in its neglect, It only takes one voice to call you back to yourself. And in that calling, something vital returns, not because you were broken, but because you were forgotten. And now, finally, remembered. We imagine healing as this big cinematic moment, a breakthrough, a confession, a revelation, but most healing in adult life is quieter, more subtle. It doesn't come in a therapist's office or after a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it comes at the end of a shift, in a booth by the window when someone leaves behind more than just a tip. It comes in the form of a handwritten note. Jung spoke about symbols, not just as abstract ideas, but as living expressions of what the conscious mind struggles to articulate. And in this story, that receipt became a symbol, a physical carrier of something deeply emotional. Recognition, encouragement, dignity. It wasn't the amount that undid her, it was the sentence, just a few words. But they reached the part of her that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, maybe even hopelessly. We underestimate what small, true gestures can do, especially for those in midlife who've grown used to emotional solitude. For people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, the wounds aren't dramatic anymore. They're layered, complicated, bound up in years of responsibilities, suppressed needs, and roles that rarely allowed room for personal healing. But healing doesn't need to be explained to be real. It just needs to be felt. When she read that note, she didn't need to analyze it. Her body responded before her mind did. The tears weren't weakness, they were release. The tight places inside her, the ones that held back grief, fatigue, longing, they loosened. Just enough for the truth to rise. And what was that truth? That her efforts mattered, that she was seen, that life hadn't forgotten her after all. We live in a society obsessed with productivity, yet moments like these remind us that presence is what heals. One moment of real presence can unravel years of emotional absence. For those watching, it might have looked like a simple tip, a nice gesture from a generous man. But for her, it was a doorway, a return, a breath. Jung would call this individuation, the integration of forgotten parts of the self back into wholeness. But for her in that moment it was simpler. I matter. Right now, just as I am. And that, more than any therapy or philosophy, is often where healing truly begins. Long after the moment passes, after the tears dry, the shift ends, and the receipt fades, something lingers. It's not just memory, it's transformation. When someone sees you at your most ordinary and chooses to affirm your extraordinary worth, that moment doesn't leave you. It settles in. It becomes part of your emotional DNA, not because it changes your circumstances, but because it restores your sense of self. For that waitress, that shift likely ended like any other. She clocked out, maybe drove home in silence. But something was different, lighter, quieter, more whole. And that shift, it ripples outward into how she shows up for her children, her co-workers, even herself. Carl Jung believed that the greatest gift we can offer the world is a fully integrated self, a person who no longer hides from their own truth and therefore no longer contributes unconsciously to the world's emotional chaos. And what begins this integration? Often it's a single act of grace, a gesture that interrupts the trance of unworthiness we've been sleepwalking through. This is what happened that day. It wasn't about celebrity or status, it was about emotional recognition and how deeply it can mark someone who thought they were invisible. That's the real epic part of this story, not the size of the tip, but the depth of the shift. Because when we're seen, we begin to see ourselves differently. And from that shift, something else emerges. Legacy. Not in the sense of fame or fortune, but in the quiet ways we carry the impact forward. Maybe that woman will remember this moment every time she doubts her value. Maybe she'll pay it forward in her own way to someone else standing quietly in the shadows. That's how emotional legacy works. It's not loud, it doesn't need recognition, but it travels from one soul to another, from one gesture to the next. For those over 45, this isn't just a touching story. It's a mirror, a reminder that even in the most routine parts of life, we are still capable of grace, both receiving it and offering it. So let this moment stay with you. Let it remind you that you're not forgotten, that kindness still lives, and that it's never too late to be seen or to see someone else. Because in the end, the most powerful transformations often begin with just one human truth: you matter.